all preparations were completed at the camp and the crossing place, Alexander set out secretly and kept at some distance from the western bank of the river, so that his march would not be observed. From the Wiles of War, 36 Military Strategies from Ancient China. To cross the sea without heaven's knowledge, one had to move openly over the sea but act as if one did not intend to cross it. Each military maneuver has two aspects: the superficial move and the underlying purpose. By concealing both, one can take the enemy completely by surprise. If it is highly unlikely that the enemy can be kept ignorant of one's actions, one can sometimes play tricks right under its nose. From the I Ching. Chaos, where brilliant dreams are born. By Su Dong. One who studies ancient tactics and employs the army in accord with their methods is no different than someone who glues up the tuning stops and yet tries to play a zither. I have never heard of anyone being successful. The acumen of strategists lies in penetrating the subtle amid unfolding change and discerning the concordant and contrary. Now, whenever mobilizing, you must first employ spies to investigate whether the enemy's commanding general is talented or not. If instead of implementing tactics, he merely relies on courage to employ the army, you can resort to ancient methods to conquer him. However, if the commanding general excels in employing ancient tactics, you should use tactics that contradict the ancient methods to defeat him. From The Theory of the Avant-Garde, by Renato Poggioli. The chief characteristic of fashion is to impose and suddenly to accept as new rule or norm what was, until a minute before, an exception or whim, then to abandon it again after it has become a commonplace, everybody's thing. Fashion's task, in brief, is to maintain a continual process of standardization, putting a rarity or novelty into general and universal use, then passing on to another rarity or novelty when the first has ceased to be such. Only modern art, because it expresses the avant-garde as its own extreme or supreme moment, or simply because it is the child of the romantic aesthetic of originality and novelty, can consider as the typical, and perhaps sole, form of the ugly what we might call ci-devant beauty, the beauty of the Ancien Régime, ex-beauty. Classical art, through the method of imitation and the practice of repetition, tends toward the ideal of renewing in the sense of integration and perfection. But for the modern art in general, and for avant-garde in particular, the only irremediable and absolute aesthetic error is the traditional artistic creation, an art that imitates and repeats itself. From the anxious modern longing for what Rémy de Gourmand chose to call, suggestively, le beau inédit, derives that sleepless and fevered experimentation, which is one of the most characteristic manifestations of the avant-garde. Its assiduous labor is an eternal web of Penelope, with the weave of its forms remade every day and unmade every night. Perhaps Ezra Pound intended to suggest both the necessity and the difficulty of such an undertaking when he once defined the beauty of art as a brief gasp between one cliché and another. The connection between the avant-garde and fashion is therefore evident. Fashion, too, is a Penelope's web. Fashion, too, passes through the phase of novelty and strangeness, surprise and scandal, before abandoning the new forms when they become cliché, kitsch, stereotype. Hence the profound truth of Baudelaire's paradox, which gives to genius the task of creating stereotypes. And from that follows, by the principle of contradiction inherent in the obsessive cult of genius in modern culture, that the avant-garde is condemned to conquer, through the influence of fashion, that very popularity it once disdained. And this is the beginning of its end. In fact, this is the inevitable, inexorable destiny of each movement. to rise up against the newly outstripped fashion of an old avant-garde, and to die when a new fashion, movement, or avant-garde appears. By Marcel Duchamp. I have forced myself to contradict myself in order to avoid conforming to my own taste. And lastly, from Warriors, Warfare and the Native American Indian, by Norman Bancroft Hunt. A similar vision among the Siouan tribes turns the warrior into a heoka, who also exhibits the clown-like behavior of the Wendigokan, the use of sacking as a war shirt and plastering the body with mud. Psychologically, the heoka was of immense importance, as were similar characters among numerous other tribes. During periods of happiness and plenty, he saw only gloom and despair, and could be goaded into providing hours of harmless amusement when he gorged himself on buffalo ribs while complaining there was no food in the camp, or declared he was dirty and proceeded to wash in a bath of mud. Yet, behind this benign face of the heoka, there lurked the ever-present fear that he was possessed by the spirit of Iktomi, and was therefore unpredictable and potentially dangerous. He, after all, was the only person who dared challenge the supernaturals, even if he was in dread of a common camp dog, and would run screaming in fright if one approached too close. Thus he made a mockery of the pretensions of some of the warriors, but at the same time emphasized the fact that the powers which guided and protected them in battle were of such strength that only a heoka might oppose them. Chapter 25. Occupy the moral high ground. The righteous strategy. In a political world, the cause you are fighting for must seem more just than the enemy's. Think of this as moral terrain that you and the other side are fighting over. By questioning your enemy's motives and making them appear evil, you can narrow their base of support and room to maneuver. Aim at the soft spots in their public image, exposing any hypocrisies on their part. Never assume that the justice of your cause is self-evident. Publicize and promote it. When you yourself come under moral attack from a clever enemy, do not whine or get angry. Fight fire with fire. If possible, position yourself as the underdog, the victim, the martyr. Learn to inflict guilt as a moral weapon. The moral offensive. In 1513, the 37-year-old Giovanni de' Medici, son of the illustrious Florentine Lorenzo de' Medici, was elected pope and assumed the name Leo X. The church that Leo now led was in many ways the dominant political and economic power in Europe, and Leo, a lover of poetry, theater, and painting, like others in his famous family, wanted to make it also a great patron of the arts. Earlier popes had begun the building of the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, the preeminent seat of the Catholic Church, but had left the structure unfinished. Leo wanted to complete this mighty project, permanently associating it with his name, but he would need to raise a fair amount of capital to be able to pay for the best artists to work on it. And so in 1517, Leo launched a campaign to sell indulgences. Then, as now, it was Catholic practice for the faithful to confess their sins to their priest, who would enforce their contrition by assigning them a penance, a kind of worldly punishment. Today, this might simply be a prayer or a counting of the rosary. But penances were once more severe, including fasts and pilgrimages, or financial payments, known as indulgences. The nobility might pay an indulgence in the form of a saintly relic purchased for their church, a large expense that would translate into the promise of a reduced time spent in purgatory after death. Purgatory being a kind of halfway house for those not evil enough for hell, not good enough for heaven, so forced to wait. The lower classes